Due to the many functions and topics that relate to the overall idea of nature of light, this topic is notorious for being pretty confusing and hard to understand. Thankfully, this video will be helping you answer a somewhat major chunk of this topic, photosynthesis. This video will be shedding light on topics such as the properties of light itself, the wavelengths of light and their interaction with plants, pigments, the structure of chloroplasts, formulas, locations, and steps of photosynthesis, and the types of plants. So get your sunglasses and protective sun gear, as I will be explaining the nature of light, the properties and interactions with life. The nature of light has three properties, those being absorbing, reflecting, and transmitting. The most good example, in my opinion, of absorbing and reflecting is with plants. Plants absorb red and blue variations of light, which will provide structure and functions within the plant, and it also reflects light, most likely green light, which will help us perceive plants as green. This is the main reason why plants are green, or most of them as, because they're reflecting this color of light. Transmitting light is mostly the same, except plants, or not plants, but glasses and other transparent objects will have light go through them. This is why you can see other objects that are not transparent over the top of glass and other objects like that. More specifically on absorbing and reflecting, the reason why plants can absorb and reflect is because of chlorophyll, aka pigments. Chlorophyll is the plant's principal pigment, being found in all plant cells and chloroplasts, while consisting of two types. The A and B types of chlorophyll will affect how the plants will look and grow. The way we can tell what chlorophyll actually absorbs and what type of light it does absorb, this can be answered with the absorption spectra of pigments chart. The optimal colors of light for plant growth. As you can see, the higher the hills of chlorophyll and carotene go, the amount of color they absorb. So in this image, chlorophyll A, which is the lines here, will be able to absorb more blue and cyan and green light compared to what B carotene can do in absorbing red light. And chlorophyll B, the more dotted one, the more dotted lines, will be able to absorb higher levels of blue and green, while not being able to absorb as much levels of red. The lower the hills are, the amount of color will not be absorbed and instead be reflected instead. This means that back to chlorophyll, chlorophyll will absorb high amounts of blue, violet, and red light. Do know that chlorophyll A and B are both in plant cells, resulting in plant's appearance. This means that because they're so low down here, the hills here are so low, this means that most plants that have chlorophyll and chlorophyll A and B will be reflecting green light. Back on the topic of plants, chlorophyll is mostly found in plant cells, and in plant cells, they are mostly found in the chloroplast organelle. Chloroplasts have a double membrane consisting of the outer and inner membranes, and also the structures inside that the membranes protect is the granum, which are groups of thylakoids. The stroma also surrounds the thylakoids and granum, however, it is a lot more liquid-based. The thylakoids and stroma, believe it or not, do not only just absorb light, but they are also part of the process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, in the most basic terms, is carbon dioxide with water combining with light being the power of everything, and now making sugar and oxygen. However, this is not that simple, as photosynthesis is made up of two reactions, the light-dependent reaction and the Calvin cycle. While these are both distinct reactions, as light-dependent reactions are dependent on light and the Calvin cycle is dependent on another reactant, these two cycles are connected, and you will see why later. In order to understand these reactions, you will have to know the reactants, which are the stuff that goes into these reactions that will help you producing the products. Light-dependent reactions and products. Well, the reactants first are H2O, otherwise known as water. Water enters the cell into photosystem 2 and it's going to start a whole chain of reactions to finally get the products in the end. Those products being ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Oxygen isn't a direct product, and the main product is actually the byproduct. However, unlike O2, ATP and NADPH will be used for the Calvin cycle as their reactants. And as an overview for light-dependent reactions, this is the first step of photosynthesis. It depends on light, and actually, light-dependent reactions use the energy from sunlight to produce the ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. However, there are many steps within the light-dependent reaction that will not only include light and water, but will including other stuff produced by the Calvin cycle. So there is a lot more steps that I will be talking about next. The PS2 or the PS1, otherwise known as the photosystem 2, is the first step in this reaction as it absorbs light energy and H2O to separate the electrons, hydrogen, and oxygen from H2O, so these can be used throughout the reaction. Then these electrons travel through the electron carriers to photosystem 1, which is also powered by light, to combine with NADP plus to create NADPH. Something that I forgot to mention in this paragraph is that light will react with photosystem 1, giving more energy to these electrons. Then, the hydrogen plus ions that have been passively entering and exiting through the membrane and also being broken apart from H2O will enter through the ATP synthase. Then this will create an energy that will add phosphate groups to ADP, turning it into ATP. There is one thing to note about the ATP synthase, and that's hydrogen plus ions actually don't do physical stuff within this reaction. What it actually does is, like I said, provide energy. So H plus ions aren't directly going to do much here. It actually just goes out of the membrane, but because of how much energy it produces within the ATP synthase, this ADP and phosphate group will be able to turn into ATP, which will be used in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle's reactants, like I said earlier, will be ATP and NADPH that will be produced from the light-dependent reaction. And CO2, while not produced by the light-independent reaction, it enters the cell through natural means such as the atmosphere. Then the products will be RUBP and glucose as the byproduct. The Calvin cycle, otherwise known as the light-dependent reaction, won't need sunlight at all. What it does need is CO2 and light-dependent reaction products of NADPH and ATP to keep the cycle going. The Calvin cycle uses these products as reactants to continuously make glucose and RUBP that will need to react with CO2 to continue the reaction and produce ADP and NADP plus for the light-dependent reaction. So, the Calvin cycle steps in more detail will have CO2 molecules that enter the chloroplast and arrives at the stroma. These molecules will interact with RUBP by the initiator rubisco, which welds one carbon atom from CO2 to RUBP. This makes a 6-carbon chain, as you see right here, that will split up into 2 equal 3-carbon chains called 3-phosphoglycerates, otherwise known as 3-PGA. Then NADPH from the light-dependent reaction affixes 1 hydrogen to each phosphoglycerate by ATP delivering energy. Do note that ATP comes first, then once it delivers energy, ADP and the phosphate group will go out, and then NADPH will come next. Since there are 5 other Calvin cycles that are happening at the same time, while there are technically 5 others, what most diagrams like this one will combine 6 together, so it's not too much happening at once. 6, or otherwise 2 G3Ps of the total 36 carbons rated from the 12 G3Ps become glucose. This is what you see here, and this will be put into the cytoplasm, otherwise known as the outsides of organelles, but the liquid within the cell membrane. And the 30 remaining carbons, as you see right here, will be turned back into RUBP for all the 6 carbon cycles. Also, ATP is used again here and will be split up into ADP and a phosphate group that will be given to the light-dependent reaction to keep it going. There are a lot of connections here because you can see right here that this will be used for the ATP synthase and this will be used for the photosystem 1, and once this is back, this RUBP being produced for each of these Calvin cycles, it will now repeat the process, thus making a whole circle. However, the Calvin cycle and the light-dependent reactions are a little bit more different in other plants. Specifically, the CAM and C4 plants will have different but not too different types of photosynthesis. Specifically, CAM plants will have plants that have adapted to dry climates by admitting air into their leaves only at night. This means that carbon dioxide is combined with existing molecules to produce organic acids by trapping carbon within the leaves. During the daytime, leaves are tightly sealed to prevent the loss of water, and these compounds release carbon dioxide, enabling carbohydrate production. Examples of CAM plants include stuff like pineapples, which, fun fact, before I did this presentation, I didn't know that pineapples actually grew this close to the ground. I thought they were just big trees. Well, it turns out those are just jackfruit trees. And for cacti, most cacti, but specifically the cactus, most of these cacti will be CAM plants. And more in-depthly, CAM pathways will separate the Calvin cycle from the oxygen building up at night and will only operate at night using CO2 that is stored as malic acid. So as you can see, this part only activates during at night and the daytime is just the regular carbon cycle. One thing to note that the Calvin cycle is pretty much normal as usual. However, there's just an added layer to this Calvin cycle, and this is the night portion. And C4 plants has a specialized chemical pathway that allows the capturing of very low levels of carbon dioxide and pass it to the Calvin cycle. First compounds formed in this pathway contains 4 carbon atoms, enabling photosynthesis to keep working under intense light and high temperatures, but it requires extra energy, ATP, to function, and C4 plant stomata stores carbon dioxide for later use during hot days to minimize water loss. Good examples of these are corn and sugarcane. And finally, the C4 pathway separates physically the mesophyll and the bundle sheath cell. It only operates in certain tissues where less oxygen is present, using stored carbon dioxide as the malic acid. As you can see here, it isn't separated by a temporal cycle, it's just physically separated by these cells. You can think of these like membranes, as they will still let things pass, unlike cell walls, but that's just a visual thing for me. So hopefully this video helped you out a ton with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can be a large topic to get into and can be pretty hard. This video only covers just the basics and some specificities of photosynthesis. So with this knowledge, just know that you can probably apply this to most other things that will be about photosynthesis that you're going to be learning. Hopefully you enjoyed and find something out of it. And yeah, alright, see ya.